The neighborhood of Willow Creek was known for its pristine lawns, perfectly aligned mailboxes, and an unspoken standard of conformity. It was the kind of place people described in brochures, the kind of neighborhood that promised serenity, order, and a sense of belonging. Families moved here dreaming of quiet evenings, children playing and neighbors who nodded politely over garden fences. Yet, beneath the trimmed hedges and freshly painted shutters, a quiet tension always lingered, a tension embodied in the figure who would soon come to dominate my life. Karen, the HOA president. Karen was infamous even before I met her. She moved through the community like a storm cloud, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning for any hint of nonconformity. Her reputation wasn't built on charm or friendliness. It was built on fear. She had a way of appearing in driveways, without warning inspecting lawns, as if she were a sovereign ruler, and leaving behind letters that could make even the most confident homeowner second-guess every decision they had made in their lives. To Karen, rules weren't guidelines, they were weapons, and everyone in Willow Creek was her target practice. The first time I met her was not in a grand confrontation or a heated argument. It was on a sunny Saturday morning, the kind of morning when the air smelled of freshly cut grass and faint chlorine from backyard pools. I had recently finished setting up my new pool, a centerpiece for summer afternoons, barbecues, and quiet reflection. It was modest but sparkling, perfectly in line with community safety standards, and it brought a sense of joy I hadn't felt in years. Children from neighboring homes squealed in delight, splashing in its clear water, while adults lounged under umbrellas, sipping iced tea. For me, it was more than a pool, it was a sanctuary. That morning, as I arranged lounge chairs by the edge of the pool, I noticed her standing at the end of my driveway. Karen. Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed my property, her posture rigid, her mouth set in a tight line. She didn't wave, she didn't nod, she didn't smile. Instead, she walked slowly, deliberately, as though each step measured the audacity of my life choices. Her clipboard clicked with each stride, a sound I would come to associate with dread. Karen's first complaint arrived in the form of a letter that afternoon, a crisp sheet of white paper stamped with the HOA's emblem. The tone was formal, almost polite, yet dripping with thinly veiled menace. My pool, she claimed, was a violation of community standards. The letter cited regulations about water features, fencing heights, and safety measures. Reading it, I felt a mix of disbelief and irritation. My pool complied with every rule. It had proper barriers, safety cobards, and all necessary permits. Yet Karen's letter insisted otherwise, demanding immediate action or face escalating fines. I was stunned. I had anticipated some minor scrutiny, perhaps a casual remark about furniture placement or garden gnomes, but never a direct attack on something so clearly lawful. The pool had been my investment, my joy, and now it had become a target for this woman who seemed to derive power from control and confrontation. The absurdity of the claim was matched only by the intensity of the threat. In Willow Creek, once Karen fixed her attention on you, life could change overnight. As days passed, the tension escalated. Karen began appearing at odd hours, standing near the pool with her clipboard, measuring tape in hand, eyes scanning for imperfections that didn't exist. Neighbors began to whisper, some offering sympathy, others nodding as if acknowledging a shared understanding. Karen didn't just enforce rules, she hunted for violations, and her favorites were pools, gardens, and anything that represented joy beyond her rigid ideals. Children's laughter at my pool became a small act of rebellion in her eyes, and she treated it as such. It wasn't long before the HOA's letters multiplied. One day, I would receive a note claiming the water was too reflective and could distract drivers. Another warned that the pool styles did not match the exact color palette approved years prior. Each communication carried threats of fines, legal action, and potential community penalties. Every new letter arrived with more audacity than the last, a pattern forming that seemed almost personal. It was no longer about rules. It was about control. Karen wanted the pool gone, and her persistence suggested she would stop at nothing. What struck me most was the way the neighborhood reacted. Many homeowners watched silently, wary of attracting Karen's scrutiny themselves. A few sympathized, sharing stories of minor infractions they had been forced to remedy under her relentless gaze. Her reputation ensured that even those who disagreed stayed quiet, fearing the consequences of speaking up. But there were glimmers of resistance. Small acts of defiance. A neighbor leaving flowers in the yard despite a letter, another hanging a colorful flag without approval. Each act of subtle rebellion gave me a sense that perhaps Karen, for all her power, could be challenged. By the end of that first week, the conflict had settled into an uneasy rhythm. I maintained my pool, documented everything meticulously, and began a silent campaign of observation. Karen's obsession was apparent in every visit, every note, every clipped word on her clipboard. And while fear lingered, I also felt a spark of determination. I realized that the pool was not just a piece of property. It had become a symbol of resistance, of individuality, of the right to enjoy life without intimidation. And if Karen wanted a war, she had unknowingly picked a target ready to fight. As the sun set over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and glimmering water, the pool reflected the colors of defiance and anticipation. Karen's silhouette lingered in my mind, a reminder that the coming weeks would not be easy, that her relentless scrutiny would test patience, resolve, and the limits of HOA power. But deep down, I knew this battle had just begun, and that in the end, the fight over a simple pool might reveal truths about control, justice, and the power of community that Karen had never anticipated. The first chapter of confrontation had been written, but the story was far from over. Karen's obsession with the pool was growing, and her next move would push the conflict to a point where patience alone would no longer suffice. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about a pool, it was about principle, pride, and the beginning of a clash that would cost more than either of us expected. The days following Karen's first wave of letters felt like a slow-motion storm. Every morning, as sunlight filtered across the sparkling surface of the pool, I felt a prickle of anticipation, knowing she could appear at any moment. It wasn't just a matter of property anymore, it had become a psychological battlefield. Karen's presence loomed over every choice I made. The arrangement of pool chairs, the height of a towel draped over the railing, even the exact placement of a sun umbrella. Every decision was scrutinized, catalogued, and critiqued with merciless precision. Her letters continued to arrive, each more audacious than the last. One morning, I found a notice pinned to my door, claiming that my pool lights were a nighttime distraction and potential hazard to passing pedestrians. Another warned that the new inflatable pool toys were non-compliant recreational items and had to be removed immediately. The absurdity of these claims was matched only by the aggressive tone and the fines threatening to spiral into the thousands. It was no longer bureaucracy, it was a campaign, a carefully orchestrated assault designed to intimidate, exhaust, and humiliate. Neighbors started noticing. A few glanced from their windows as Karen paced the edge of the pool, her clipboard clutched tightly, eyes scanning every inch of water and deck. Some whispered in hushed tones about the infamous HOA president, warning each other that crossing her meant inevitable confrontation. Others offered quiet words of encouragement, small nods of solidarity, as if acknowledging the injustice in the air. Yet, for the majority, fear ruled. Silence became a survival tactic, a way to avoid her attention. And while the pool had once been a source of joy, it had now become a symbol of tension, a focal point for community anxiety. As the week progressed, Karen's tactics became more personal. She appeared unannounced while I was tending to the garden, measuring tiles, counting pavers, and scrutinizing fencing seams. Her presence was deliberate, meant to unsettle. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, followed every motion. I documented everything, taking photographs, noting times, and saving letters. I knew that meticulous records might be my only defense if her attacks escalated beyond mere fines. Yet her relentless scrutiny began to wear on everyone, myself included. Even the children, who once splashed freely in the water, began to sense the tension, hesitation, replacing carefree laughter. One afternoon, a particularly aggressive letter arrived, claiming that my pool violated the HOA's visual harmony clause and required immediate alteration. According to Karen, the shape and depth of the pool disrupted neighborhood symmetry. She demanded modifications, inspections, and compliance verification within a week, threatening astronomical fines for failure to comply. I stared at the letter in disbelief, recognizing that her focus had shifted from minor enforcement to total control. It was no longer about rules or safety, it was about dominance, a need to assert authority over anyone daring to enjoy life outside her rigid standards. By now, the community was beginning to stir. Conversations that had previously skirted around the topic of HOA enforcement began to surface. I overheard murmurs of support, of neighbors recalling past grievances, of small acts of quiet rebellion. The ripple effect was subtle but growing. Karen's obsession had inadvertently galvanized a sense of defiance. People who had once hidden behind compliance now began to question the legitimacy of her power. Yet, despite these small victories, her attacks became more invasive. She monitored not just my pool, but my interactions, my schedules, even casual gatherings of friends and family. Every splash, every laugh, every sunlit moment became ammunition in her pursuit of control. The psychological pressure intensified as the fines accumulated. Each letter carried not only financial threats, but also a tone of moral judgment, suggesting that my enjoyment of the pool reflected selfishness and disregard for the community standard. The absurdity of it was yet the weight of constant confrontation began to strain nerves and patience. Late nights were spent reviewing HOA regulations, studying past enforcement actions, and documenting every possible detail to protect myself. Every interaction with Karen became a strategic exercise, a delicate balancing act between compliance and resistance. Then came the first physical manifestation of her campaign. A formal inspection. Karen arrived with a small entourage of HOA board members, their clipboards and cameras ready. They measured water levels, analyzed tile placement, photographed equipment, and scribbled notes with an air of authority that made clear they expected obedience. The inspection lasted hours, a meticulous and exhausting evaluation designed to overwhelm. I remained calm, documenting their every move, knowing that the more aggressive they were, the stronger my eventual counter would be. Neighbors observed discreetly from windows and porches. Some whispered encouragement, others shook their heads in frustration, silently cursing the tyranny that had overtaken their once friendly neighborhood. Even as Karen led her entourage across my backyard, barking orders and noting imagined violations, it became clear that her campaign had shifted from mere enforcement to a display of intimidation. Her mission was not simply compliance. It was control, power, and the demonstration of authority. By the end of the inspection, the tension had reached a peak. Karen left with a final note warning that additional fines, inspections, and potential legal action were imminent. Yet in her overreach, she had unknowingly exposed her obsession, revealing vulnerabilities that could be leveraged later. My resolve hardened. The pool was no longer just a source of summer fun, it had become a symbol of resilience, a focal point for resistance, and a strategic asset in a battle of wills. That evening, as I reviewed photographs, letters, and notes, a plan began to form. Karen had overplayed her hand. Her obsession was documented, her threats predictable, her tactics transparent. The more she tried to dominate, the more evidence I accumulated. The pool, once merely a symbol of leisure, had become the center of a narrative about control, harassment, and eventual retribution. The chapter of passive endurance was over. The next phase would require strategy, cunning, and patience. Karen had opened a door, and I was ready to step through it, turning her obsession into a liability. While the community watched quietly, a storm was forming not above the pool, but in the balance of power itself. By the following week, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted from tension to palpable unease. Karen's relentless pursuit of pool perfection had made her a looming presence, and every interaction with her felt like navigating a minefield. Yet beneath the anxiety, a subtle undercurrent of opportunity began to emerge. With every overreaching letter, every invasive inspection, and every documented threat. She was leaving a trail of evidence, and I had become meticulous in collecting it. The pool, once a private sanctuary, had now become the epicenter of strategy, a stage on which the drama of control and defiance played out for all to see. The first strike wasn't loud or dramatic, it was deliberate and calculated. Armed with a growing dossier of photographs, letters, and recorded interactions, I prepared a formal response to the most outrageous violations. Document each citation of HOA regulations, and each time-stamped photograph was organized meticulously to show not just compliance, but the absurdity of Karen's accusations. The goal was not to engage in direct confrontation yet, but to establish a narrative that could not be ignored, a narrative that painted her obsession in stark relief. Karen, oblivious to the meticulous records being compiled against her, continued her daily patrols. She measured, photographed, and documented, each action adding to the growing body of evidence that would eventually expose her campaign of harassment. Her presence, once intimidating, began to reveal cracks in her armor. Moments of overzealous note-taking, misplaced assumptions, and contradictions in her claims became apparent to anyone paying attention. The more she tried to dominate, the more transparent her obsession became. Neighbors, initially wary, began to notice the pattern. Whispers of support started circulating. A few bold homeowners, emboldened by the sheer absurdity of Karen's campaign, began to share their own grievances with me, quietly. Stories emerged of fines for minor infractions, accusations of unauthorized decorations, and inspections that stretched for hours. The narrative shifted subtly. Karen was no longer just a disciplinarian. She was a tyrant, and the evidence was mounting. The timing of my first formal challenge coincided with her most audacious accusation yet, a claim that the pool's decorative lighting was a public hazard visible from neighboring properties. The letter demanded immediate removal, accompanied by a fine that equaled several months of HOA fees. The audacity of this claim was staggering, but I saw it as an opportunity. One organized a thorough rebuttal, documenting the safety features of the lights, their installation according to code, and photographs showing the absence of any obstruction or hazard. Every piece of evidence was catalogued, time-stamped, and presented clearly. When the response was submitted, the tension became electric. Karen, upon receiving the rebuttal, was visibly unsettled. Her meticulous control was being challenged with facts, and the narrative she had relied on to assert authority began to unravel. The letters she had sent, meant to intimidate, now became evidence of her overreach. The pool, which had been the target of her obsession, had transformed into a tool of empowerment. It was no longer just a body of water. It was a symbol of resistance, a focal point around which the balance of power was shifting. As the days passed, Karen's tactics became more aggressive. She intensified her inspections, often arriving unannounced and scrutinizing every detail of the pool and surrounding areas. Yet each intrusion was meticulously documented, creating a detailed record of her harassment. The community began to notice, and subtle glances of concern, followed by quiet nods of support, indicated that the seeds of rebellion were sprouting. Karen's tyranny, once absolute, was encountering resistance, not just from me, but from the neighborhood itself. The turning point came with an unplanned inspection. Karen appeared with a small group of board members, their demeanor smug and authoritative. They measured the water depths, scrutinized the tiles, and photographed pool equipment as though preparing for an evidence dossier. I recorded everything from a safe distance, capturing video that clearly showed the exaggerated nature of their concerns. Every exaggerated measurement, every pointed finger, every expression of disdain became part of a growing record that would later prove invaluable. By the end of the day, it was clear that Karen's obsession had inadvertently created a liability for herself. Her insistence on control, coupled with the meticulous documentation I had maintained, meant that her next move would be scrutinized, dissected, and potentially used against her. The pool, once a private haven, had become a stage for strategy, resistance, and eventual reckoning. Late that night, reviewing the day's documentation, the plan became clear. The first strike was not about confrontation or revenge, it was about preparation, about turning Karen's own obsession into evidence of overreach. By exposing her meticulous tyranny through facts, photographs, and recordings, the narrative could be shifted. The pool, the center of her fixation, would serve as a symbol of resilience, and the catalyst for the community's eventual awakening. As Chapter 3 closed, the first strike had been made. Subtle yet effective. The narrative was beginning to shift. Power dynamics were tilting, and the stage was set for the next phase. Turning evidence into leverage, and preparing for the confrontation that would shake the HOA to its core. 4. The reckoning begins the following week brought an air of quiet tension across the neighborhood. Karen, frustrated by the meticulous rebuttal to her previous letters, had shifted into overdrive. Her inspections became daily routines, her notes increasingly petty, her criticisms ever more absurd. Yet with each act of overreach, she left behind tangible evidence of her obsession, evidence that was no longer confined to private correspondence, but now captured in photographs, video, and sworn observations from other homeowners who had grown weary of her tyranny. The stage was set for a reckoning, though Karen had no idea that her own actions were fueling the fire that would soon engulf her. The turning point began with the HOA board meeting, scheduled under the guise of routine governance, but clearly orchestrated by Karen to assert her dominance. The room was small, the walls lined with framed photographs of the neighborhood, their polished surfaces reflecting the tension in the air. Karen arrived early, clipboard in hand, scanning every seat, every table. As if by sheer presence she could intimidate anyone who dared challenge her authority. Yet this time, the energy in the room was different. Her peers and neighbors were no longer passive observers. They had begun to see the patterns, the inconsistencies, and the petty tyranny that had ruled their community. I arrived with a binder thicker than any previously presented documentation. It was not just a collection of pool-related evidence. It contained a chronicle of Karen's actions, letters, photographs, and video clips meticulously catalogued. Every overreach, every absurd accusation, and every retaliatory threat was recorded. The binder was a visual representation of months of harassment, a testament to her obsession with control and the subtle ways in which she had manipulated the HOA for personal gratification. The room, once a chamber of her dominance, was about to become the arena for her exposure. As Karen began her speech, highlighting her concerns about neighborhood standards and property values, it became evident that she expected compliance, nods of agreement, and silence. But, instead, a subtle shift occurred. Homeowners who had previously remained quiet began exchanging glances, the unspoken recognition that her actions had overstepped legal and moral bounds was palpable. When I laid out the binder, placing it deliberately in front of the board and sliding it toward the center of the table, the room's energy shifted again. Karen's confident posture faltered slightly as she realized that her obsession had produced an undeniable trail of evidence. The first phase of the reckoning unfolded quietly but unmistakably. Each page turned, each photograph displayed, and each time-stamped video clip shown systematically dismantled her narrative. The pool lights she had deemed hazardous were shown functioning perfectly, installed to code, and unobtrusive to neighbors. Complaints about minor landscaping or decorative elements were revealed as inconsistent, selective, and often contradictory. By the time the first segment of evidence was presented, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. What had been invisible to most had now become undeniable, and Karen's credibility was beginning to crack. As the meeting progressed, the collective weight of the evidence began to tilt the balance of power. Neighbors, emboldened by the clarity and thoroughness of the documentation, started to speak up, not in anger or confrontation, but in calm and deliberate support. Each testimonial revealed a pattern. Karen's harassment extended far beyond a single pool. Fines for trivial matters, inspections for cosmetic deviations, and selective enforcement were all part of a broader campaign of control. The neighborhood, once fractured and fearful, was starting to unify. Karen's attempts to interject, dismiss, or reframe the evidence only exacerbated the situation. Every objection, every attempt at distraction, was countered by documentation that had been meticulously prepared in advance. Her credibility waned further with each passing minute, and the board, once passive enablers, began to recognize the magnitude of the situation. The shift in authority was subtle but undeniable. Karen was no longer the unquestioned enforcer. She had become the subject of scrutiny. Outside the meeting room, the atmosphere was equally charged. Neighbors who had previously avoided engagement began to whisper, share information, and gather in small groups. The sense of collective empowerment grew, fueled by the clear evidence of her obsessive and often petty enforcement. The pool, central to the drama, had transformed into a symbol of resistance. What had once been a private leisure space had become the linchpin in a growing campaign to restore fairness and transparency to the neighborhood. By the time the meeting concluded, the first phase of the reckoning was complete. Karen, visibly shaken and frustrated, realized that her authority had been undermined not by confrontation alone but by meticulous preparation, strategy, and evidence. The neighborhood had begun to reclaim its voice, its autonomy, and its sense of community. The pool, the object of her fixation, had become the epicenter of empowerment, proving that even the most obsessive enforcer could be challenged with patience, precision, and clarity. As the sun set that evening, the tension lingered, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. Karen's obsession, which had once instilled fear, now revealed vulnerability. The groundwork for further action was laid, and the next phase would involve leveraging the evidence, building alliances, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation that would decide the balance of power in the neighborhood once and for all. The morning after the board meeting, a quiet but palpable shift swept across the neighborhood. Karen, once the unchallenged enforcer, moved with a cautious vigilance. Her once commanding presence had become tense and measured, every glance over the shoulder revealing a flicker of uncertainty. What had started as isolated resistance around my pool had now evolved into a full-scale awakening of the community. Neighbors who had previously whispered in private were now stepping into the light, emboldened by the evidence presented at the meeting and the clarity of collective purpose. As the days unfolded, the cracks in Karen's dominion became more visible. Notices that had once carried unquestioned authority began to be questioned openly. Homeowners scrutinized the legitimacy of fines, inspected her paperwork, and documented their interactions with her. Mirroring the meticulous approach I had taken, the power dynamic had shifted, and Karen was now operating under the weight of scrutiny she had never anticipated. The same obsession that had given her control now worked against her, exposing inconsistencies, contradictions, and clear overreach. The HOA board, previously a quiet enabler of her actions, began to fracture. Some members, seeing the tide of evidence and neighbor testimony, quietly distanced themselves from Karen's most extreme measures. Others, fearing exposure or legal liability, began to reconsider the decisions they had once rubber-stamped. Karen's ability to influence them waned, as she faced not only the scrutiny of the neighborhood, but also the reality that her allies were no longer assured. Isolation, previously an invisible weapon used against the community, was now her own. Public sentiment, which had once been carefully manipulated, transformed rapidly. Conversations on sidewalks, in driveways, and at neighborhood gatherings were dominated by discussion of fairness, accountability, and the persistent overreach that Karen had exhibited for months. The pool, once a flashpoint for petty complaints, became the emblem of resistance. It symbolized both the absurdity of her obsession and the possibility of reclaiming autonomy from a previously unchecked authority. With each retelling, the narrative strengthened. Tyrant was no longer just a critic of a pool. She was a cautionary figure whose empire of fear was unraveling. The pressure mounted when homeowners began submitting formal complaints and evidence of harassment to the HOA board and, in some cases, local authorities. Documentation included timestamps of her inspections, recordings of confrontations, photographs of inconsistent violations, and sworn statements attesting to selective enforcement. What had once been private grievances were now transformed into an organized, strategic pushback. The collective effort rendered Karen's previous tactics ineffective. Intimidation no longer worked when the power of numbers and evidence combined to hold her accountable. As the legal and procedural processes moved forward, Karen's attempts to regain control were increasingly desperate. Notices were sent with threatening language, fines escalated, and attempts were made to portray dissenting neighbors as disruptive or unreasonable. Yet each action she took was met with resistance fortified by evidence, witness accounts, and prior documentation. The more she tried to manipulate the system, the more she exposed herself to scrutiny, weakening her credibility further. The empire she had built on fear and obsession was now built on a foundation of instability, ready to collapse under its own weight. The turning point came when a formal HOA review, prompted by the complaints and evidence, revealed not just petty overreach, but patterns of abuse. They reviewed detailed selective enforcement, inconsistent application of rules, and attempts to suppress dissenting voices. It became clear that Karen had weaponized her authority not to maintain standards, but to control and intimidate, and the documentation left no room for denial. Her tactics, once cloaked in the guise of community standards, were revealed in stark contrast to the reality experienced by neighbors. With the HOA review in hand, the board convened a meeting to address the findings. Karen arrived expecting compliance, perhaps even silence from the community. But what greeted her was a united front. Homeowners, now fully aware of the extent of her overreach, presented the findings systematically. Every complaint, every anecdote, every act of intimidation was corroborated and validated. Karen, once confident and commanding, struggled to maintain composure. The narrative she had constructed crumbled under the weight of truth and collective observation. The fallout was swift. Karen was stripped of her enforcement privileges, removed from any positions of authority within the HOA, and faced formal admonitions for her conduct. Fines she had levied without merit were reversed, and policies were enacted to prevent similar abuses in the future. The pool, once a battleground, had become a symbol not only of resistance, but also of the triumph of preparation, persistence, and community unity over obsession and fear. By the end of the week, Karen's once omnipotent influence had vanished. Neighbors walked their streets with renewed confidence, free from the constant scrutiny and petty harassment that had previously defined daily life. Conversations no longer carried the undertone of fear but were instead filled with stories of collaboration, triumph, and the restoration of fairness. The pool, gleaming in the afternoon sun, stood as a testament to victory not claimed through confrontation alone, but through meticulous documentation, strategy, and the collective strength of a community united. The weeks following Karen's removal from power marked the beginning of a new era in the neighborhood. What had been a tense, fearful community slowly transformed into a place of renewed trust and cooperation. The shadow that Karen had cast, long and oppressive, finally lifted, revealing a neighborhood eager to heal. Streets once silent with apprehension now buzzed with casual conversation. Lawns, once scrutinized under her watchful eyes, were tended freely, each homeowner asserting personal style without fear of arbitrary fines. The pool, once a symbol of conflict, now stood at the center of neighborhood pride, a reminder of what had been defended and Karen, meanwhile, was a figure of isolation. Removed from any formal position within the HOA, she was left to confront the consequences of her actions alone. Attempts to regain influence through complaints or manipulations were dismissed, her credibility shattered. Former allies, recognizing the risks of association, distanced themselves swiftly. Where she had once commanded attention and instilled fear, she was now met with quiet indifference or polite avoidance. Each attempt to assert herself publicly only emphasized the stark contrast between her past dominance and her present error. Formal investigations confirmed her selective enforcement, harassment, and abuse of HOA authority. Reversals of fines, policy reforms, and potential civil liability underscored the seriousness of her misconduct. Karen had not only lost the informal power she wielded with such vigor, but also faced accountability under formal processes designed to protect homeowners from such abuses. The neighborhood's triumph over her tyranny was both symbolic and structural, creating lasting safeguards against future overreach. Community unity became a guiding principle in the aftermath. Homeowners began organizing events that fostered cooperation, transparency, and shared responsibility. Committees were formed to oversee property standards collectively, ensuring fairness, consistency, and open communication. The lessons learned from Karen's reign influenced the establishment of policies that balanced accountability with compassion, preventing any single individual from accumulating unchecked authority. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear, now thrived on collaboration and mutual respect. The pool remained central to this renewed sense of identity. Its water shimmered in the sunlight, a living monument to persistence, strategy, and the victory of preparation over tyranny. Children splashed freely. Neighbors gathered for small celebrations, and the community used the space not only for leisure, but as a symbol of resilience. The pool, which had been the focal point of Karen's obsession and the source of endless conflict, had transformed into a shared emblem of empowerment and victory. Even as the neighborhood celebrated, the memory of the ordeal remained instructive. Conversations often included reflections on how fear and control could manipulate daily life and the importance of documentation, preparation, and collective action. Stories of Karen's petty inspections, arbitrary fines, and strategic harassment were recounted with both astonishment and relief, a cautionary tale for the future. The neighborhood had not only survived her reign but emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more cohesive. Karen's attempts to reassert herself outside of official HOA matters were met with resistance or invitations to meetings were declined. Community initiatives proceeded without her input, and her presence became increasingly peripheral. Her focus on trivial disputes contrasted sharply with the proactive, collaborative energy now defining the neighborhood. She had underestimated the power of evidence, persistence, and community solidarity, and the result was a total reversal of her once commanding influence. Financial restitution and structural reforms further cemented this transformation. Any funds unjustly collected through fines were returned, and policies were revised to prevent similar abuses. Homeowners, once wary of arbitrary enforcement, could now trust that standards would be applied fairly, consistently, and transparently. The HOA, restructured and guided by principles of accountability, became a tool for empowerment rather than intimidation. The scars of conflict had created not only vigilance, but also a stronger, more resilient governance framework. As months passed, the neighborhood flourished. Gardens bloomed with individuality. Homes displayed unique yet tasteful characteristics, and communal spaces were enjoyed without fear of scrutiny. Residents who had once hesitated to engage now participated actively, ensuring the collective voice remained strong. Karen, once a figure of dread and control, faded into the background, a reminder of what had been overcome rather than an ongoing threat. The pool, central to both conflict and resolution, remained the heart of the neighborhood's rebirth. It symbolized the power of perseverance, strategic planning, and the unity of individuals standing together against arbitrary authority. What had begun as a personal struggle had evolved into a community-wide lesson, one that emphasized the importance of fairness, transparency, and courage in the face of intimidation. In the end, the story of Karen and the pool became a legend within the neighborhood, retold to new residents, and shared as both entertainment and instruction. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The community had reclaimed its voice, and the pool had become a symbol of triumph, freedom, and resilience. Where fear had once reigned, unity now thrived, proving that careful preparation, strategic action, and collective courage could overcome even the most obsessive and controlling adversaries. The chapter of Karen's tyranny had closed, replaced by a new narrative, one of empowerment, accountability, and the enduring strength of a neighborhood that refused to be controlled. The pool, glistening under the afternoon sun, stood as the quiet, enduring witness to a story of conflict, strategy, and ultimate victory, a reminder that no single person could dominate a united community.